being lighthearted about life, really, rather than heavy-hearted about life. Because we might think maybe we do have many lives, but the one that we're having right now is the one we're experiencing, and it's nicer to be able to have a lighter heart. Horses can definitely help us with that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Reinforce the Horse. Today we are here with Rupert Isaacson, and Rupert is the creative force behind Horseboy. Rowan is his mentor, teacher, and muse. Together, all aspects of Horseboy begin and from there, the wider team helps to develop each aspect. Rupert grew up half in London and half on a remote horse farm in the British countryside, with Africa looming large in his life. He was a journalist for the British and American press from the early 1900s and has published several guidebooks to Africa and India. He is also the author of 3 non-fiction memoirs, The Healing Land, The Horseboy, and The Long Ride Home. He runs the Horseboy Foundation, which offers services to autism families. He partners with Eliane Lawrence to teach the Horseboy method, Horseboy learning, and other kinetic learning techniques, along with stress-free dressage. He founded the Indigenous Land Rights Fund in 2004, which helps hunting and gathering tribes gain legal title to their ancestral land. Rupert has loved horses all his life and has worked alongside them through cross-country riding and classical dressage. Rupert, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I didn't realize I was so old. According to your bio, I've been a journalist since the early 1900s. So I am, consequently feeling fantastic at 100.
I love this.
24. So yeah, it's good. I thought I was looking a bit old on the Zoom, but then I was like, if I'm 124, then I'm sort of allowed to, really.
This.
Yeah.
Oh goodness, I love this. I'm so happy to have you here today and have a discussion with you about life and horses and hear more about your journey. It's I feel like this is going to be a fun conversation.
I'm a lover of fun. So,
yeah, I could already tell just the energy here is just going to be fun to hop onto. And thank you so much for being here. And can you just start with giving us sort of a background on like how horses entered your life?
Yeah. As you say, I always loved them. And I was born to non-horsey parents, I think, like a lot of people who find their way to horses. But there had been horses in my family before that. And I think a lot of people find this, that horses sometimes skip a generation. So my parents were not horsey, and they brought me up in the middle of London. But my great aunt, who was my mother's aunt, was extremely horsey. And she had a farm about 2.5 hours north of London in a place called Leicestershire. And so we used to go up there often. And when I was about 3, they would find me, sitting in the grass in the field with the old retired hunt horses and just chatting to them. And I wanted to ride very badly. And my parents, like many urban parents, quite understandably were quite resistant to the idea. However, in my late childhood, I suffered a nervous breakdown. And I said, I think that if I could learn to ride, that would sort me out for my mental health. And so my parents said, okay, fine. And so then I was taught to ride up in Leicestershire where my great aunt was. And then I said, well, now I would like to have a horse. And so the deal that we made was that I would go around the neighbourhood in North London where I was brought up, which is called Islington, and I would clean out people's garages, which were full of junk. And then I would sell this junk, this is aged about 12, at a flea market in North London. And I'd sell anything, and I just, every weekend I was there selling stuff. And I eventually made enough money to buy a retired racehorse off the track who was an absolute lunatic, and I was punching way above my weight trying to ride this horse. So of course he taught me everything, and I kept him with my aunt. So I still lived in London. I would have to go up every weekend on the train, and then I was there, of course, every holiday. And luckily for me, I had a mentor. It always comes down to mentorship. A woman called Trudy, who lived on the farm and helped look after the old horses in return for living rent free. And she was a very, very good rider. And she took me under her wing and really taught me. And I fell into the local riding culture in that area of England, which is where cross-country riding, particularly fox hunting, and therefore eventing and steeplechasing and point-to-pointing and all team chasing and all the cross-country type of disciplines, pursuits come from it. It began there in the 18th century and sort of has been going there ever since. So if you think about jumping fences in a forward seat, it sort of originated there. And this horse was, frankly, a little bit dangerous to do this stuff on. So naturally, just trying to stick on him and survive taught me a lot. And if you come into horses through the sort of non-moneyed way, and you become kind of quite good with difficult horses, then you sort of end up automatically on a bit of a professional track. So by the time I was in my late teens, people were offering me rides on other horses and asking me to take on some tricky horses here or tricky horses there. And so I fell into horse training, although back then I'd not say I was really a horse trainer. I was just a half decent person on the back of a horse. And I've been going ever since. And then I fell into the whole classical dressage thing through a complete backdoor. Because when my son Rowan, who was nonverbal and autistic, became verbal in the saddle in front of me, and I noticed that the rhythm that the horse was in made a difference to whether he talked or not. And then I started working with other kids and found the same thing, and realized that the more collected the horse was, the more communication I got. Then I realized I had to learn more about collection, and that's dressage. So then I ended up going again for mentorship with a very, very famous family down in Portugal called the Valença family, who specialized in teaching how to train all the dressage stuff while walking next to the horse, so that the horse fully understands everything when you come to ride it before you even come to ride it. And ever since then, I've had this sort of interesting parallel career with horses. You know, one side completely in the therapeutic and the other side very much in the dressage, but to me, they're the same thing. So, but I'm still a lover of cross-country riding. I still jump. I still go have fun on horses just because it's fun. And I live here in Germany. I've got 7 horses here and a few horses dotted around in the USA at some of our therapeutic centers that we trained. And our horses both serve families, people with trauma, people with autism, all of those things. But at the same time, people who are really interested in learning about classical dressage can come and sit on them and feel all those beautiful high school movements like piaffe and passage and flying changes and pirouettes and all that lovely stuff. And what's nice is that that's the same horse that then goes and serves the autistic kid. So it sort of makes the point that there's really no separation between a performance horse, quote unquote, and a therapy horse. It's the same horse. And just like us, they like a variety of work. And they like to serve. I think there's often a misunderstanding in the horse world of people feeling that horses are in servitude or slaves to humans. And although that can be the case, and hopefully it's not the case, but less and less it's the case, I think horses, like all animals, including ourselves, like to be in service. They just like to have agency and choice in that. And so that's sort of what we do. And
I love that. And I love that you bring up choice. And choice is a huge thing that we've discussed here on the podcast, and Dad and I collectively. You mentioned something on Warwick's show where you were talking about your son Rowan and his autism, and how you believe and you know that telling a child from a young age that they they're not okay with they're not okay the way they are because of, say, a disability or anything, and that has a tendency to destroy spirits and create a broken human being in later on in life. And this begged a question in me as to how you feel like that relates to a lot of horses in our world.
Well, I think anything, if you approach any organism with, including an earthworm or a frog or an amoeba, with an attitude of you're not okay how you are, then they might feel not okay how they are, and that could be expressed in various forms of unhappiness. They could explode and rebel. They could implode and sort of go shut you out. They could, but whatever they do, it's not a good message. I think that when people give that message to horses, it can come sometimes because they don't necessarily mean to give that message to the horses. But they perhaps don't understand why the horse's behaviors might be happening. And so if the horse's behaviors are not functional in terms of what the person needs, or perhaps not safe in terms of what the person needs, because horses are dangerous, then naturally the human reaction is fear. And as soon as we react with fear, we're going to put a label on something, because we have to, in a way. We have to say, what is this problem that I must survive? Is it an elephant? Is it a man with an AK-47? Is it a speeding car? Is it a quote-unquote misbehaving horse? And I think what's often misunderstood, unfortunately, with horses is they're very, very, very playful. And they're very, very, very curious. And those two things, if expressed with great ebullience when you're sitting on them, can not go so well for a monkey. And if you're standing next to them, can also go not so well for a monkey. Because if you watch how horses play with each other, there's a reason why we call rough play among kids horseplay, because they're very, very rough with each other. They are. It's how they are. Watch horses in the field, watch horses in the wild. They bang each other up a fair bit. It's like they play rugby when they're playing. And often when they're not playing too, they can corner each other and kick each other and things. And we can often be actually quite nicer to horses than they are to each other necessarily. But the difficulty I think that a lot of us get into is it's not explained to us when we're getting into horses what the genetic quality of a domestic horse is. So a domestic horse has been bred over millennia. Literally the most domestic riding and driving horses that are used in the world today go back to one tribe in the is it the Samsara? I'll look up the name of the tribe, who were living at the beginning of the Bronze Age in what is now the Volga-Don basin of Western Russia. And this particular tribe selectively bred from the wild stock, which was a light horse, already quite a hot horse, similar to the modern day Turkoman or even thoroughbred. And they were taking that horse and they were refining it to the point where it became a super athlete that could go all day carrying monkeys on their back, carrying monkeys in chariots, and really take you on campaign and, do that happily until the age of 25. And so not much has changed in horse breeding since then. So we have, if you think about even 50, 60 years ago, what people expected to do on their horses, you would go do your chores on a horse. I grew up going into town and doing shopping on horses, and that sort of thing. You weren't just riding them recreationally. And so then if you rode them recreationally, that was on top of the work you were already doing. So perhaps if you were a hunting farmer in my area of England 100 years ago, you had a light draft horse that you could also ride. He pulled the cart and he did the light agricultural work all week, took you to church on Sunday, and which might have been, 20 miles away. And then you hunted him also at the weekend. And a hunting day is like 8 hours over huge fences, out of the mud, in the teeth of winter. And you might do that, once a week on top of everything else. And the horse just showing up fine, big super athlete, etc. Now we are living these kind of suburban lives. And we ourselves have become rather tame. And we are also our super athletes that have been selectively breeding ourselves over hundreds of thousands of years to be hunter-gatherers long before we ever did anything like stupid, like trying to sit on top of a zebra. And so the real problem is boredom. We bore our horses, and because they're so playful and they're so curious and they're such super athletes, and we often just don't give them the outlet for that energy, then the same behaviors can appear that would appear in a human in that regard. So it's more helpful, I think, to explain to people, look, it's really nothing personal when a horse is, quote unquote, acting up. It is just simply releasing energy. How are you going to catch and channel and dance with that energy? Because this horse is not a wild creature. It's a selectively bred domestic creature that's really a product to a large degree of the human mind. Very different to like a Przewalski's horse in the middle of Mongolia. Even Mustangs, they're feral. They're not wild as wolf is to dog. They're like feral dogs that have gone back to the wild, but there is still a difference. So they are genetically predisposed to interact with people, because when you are breeding horses for your livelihood, and your livelihood depends upon horses, as it used to and still does in some parts of the world, like Mongolia or South America, then you naturally breed to the horses that are the most human-centered, human-focused, and you don't breed to the horses that are not, because that's just not practical. So the horse really wants your input and wants your interaction and wants to connect with you, and at the same time has all this energy. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to dance with that? And that can look infinite. There's no right or wrong way of doing that, but the energy does have to go somewhere. So yeah, I think when people are approaching horses without that understanding, it can lead naturally to misunderstandings.
That makes sense. And there's a lot in that, expressing curiosity and playfulness. It makes so much sense why there's so many children that are drawn to horses, because children seem to naturally have this sense of playfulness and curiosity, even just from a young age.
Well, of course, humans are the same. We're curious monkeys. We have to be. It's both our blessing and our curse, right? And also movement is completely tied up with the brain in all mammals, probably in reptiles too. So I don't know if you're aware of the word neuroplasticity, meaning, the development of the brain. And this can, of course, be in a positive way. It can also be in a negative way. But we hope it's in a positive way. If it's in a positive way, it is reliant on a protein that gets produced in the brain when you move and problem solve at the same time. And this is called BDNF. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Neuro means brain cells. Trophic, as in a trophy that you might win, is the old Greek word to grow, growing of brain cells. Basically, the brain growing more of itself. And so when humans move and problem solve, they get cleverer, and horses the same. And if they don't move enough, their brains kind of atrophy a little bit. There's a there's a parallel here with dementia. You know, if you put old people in old people parking, their brain dies. And with young people, if they don't move enough, the brain doesn't develop properly. And it's exactly the same with horses and dogs and any other mammal. So we do have to think about movement, play, exploration, fun. And if we're thinking along those lines, we're probably going to get it right.
How did you decide to ultimately bring your son into this realm of horses?
I didn't. I was trying to keep him away from horses. I thought he wasn't safe around horses. It was all him. But what did happen? Are you aware of somebody called Temple Grandin, Dr. Temple Grandin? Do you know who she is? She's a celebrity. Okay, she's a celebrity in the world of autism. She's a professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University. She's in her 70s now. And she, when she was 3, she was nonverbal, rocking in a corner, wiping her poo on the walls. And her dad was going to institutionalize her. And her mum said, no, I can see there's an intellect in there. I'm going to try to follow her obsessive interests and find my way in. And she indeed did. And horses were one of the ways for Temple. She's now a professor. She also revolutionized the slaughter industry in the USA to make slaughterhouses less stressful for the animals that go through them, for which she receives death threats from the animal rights lobby. She also is a neuroscientist and writes books on autism and the brain and so on. And when my son was diagnosed, and he was to some degree unsafe around the kinds of horses that I had at that time, because they were all hyperreactive, sport horses. And he was very unpredictable in his behaviors and could spook them. But I thought I need a mentor here. I mean, my whole story is all about me seeking mentorship, really. If I have one talent, it's knowing what I don't know. And then I will go and look for somebody who does. So I thought, okay, I need a mentor. What qualities must this mentor have? They have to be autistic, because anyone who's not autistic will just have an opinion, but that's not the same as lived experience. And then they must have started life as severe as my son, nonverbal, incontinent, harming themselves with big tantrums and so on, and have somehow made it. Who's that person? And that's Dr. Temple Grandin. So I got an interview with her, sat in her office and said, how does my son become you? And she told me to do 3 things. To follow the child in sensorily and emotionally, physically with observation, and intellectually by really noticing anything that sparked their interest and following that. And then to do as much of my stuff with my kid outside as I could, because there's fewer bad sensory triggers in nature, and to let him move as much as possible, because they're kinetic learners. In fact, most people are kinetic learners, really. And so I did that. And he wanted to go outside and put stuff in his mouth. And a lot of parents says, freak out about that. I was in Texas, which is a relatively hostile environment. There are a lot of poisonous plants. But I had lived in the Kalahari with Bushman hunting and gathering tribes. And I know from that most things you see in a given environment are actually edible. So I quickly sort of learned the 10 most obvious edible plants in central Texas where I was, and we went foraging, and I couldn't explain what was edible and what was not. So I would say, let's go look for daddy leaves. These over here, poison ivy, it's not daddy leaf. No, terrible. This over here, daddy leaves, yum. The wild violets, the greenbrier tips and other things like that. So we would go and gather daddy leaves, and we still do to this day. And it was in the course of one of these that he noticed my neighbor's quarter horse mare on the other side of the woods and ran to her and forged his own relationship with her. Now, I knew this horse, and I knew she was very quiet and very good and very sweet. And so really, first I was mentored by Temple Grandin while I was trying to keep my son away from horses. Then I followed what she told me to do. He found his way to horses.
Oh, this is great. So it just really plays into that idea of choice and freedom and even play. and then it's just, you just allowed it to be. And I've heard a lot of that, like even outside of, like conditions we would call autism or such. Like even when it comes to spirituality, it's like a lot of people have, certain tilts toward being like the clairs, like clairaudient or clairvoyant or mediumship or whatever it might be. And we tend to, it seems like instead of allowing that stuff to happen, we just shut it out altogether and say it's weird, and you're imagining things, and then people tend to carry that stuff with them like their entire life. It doesn't go away. Even empathy, something as simple as, or seemingly simple as empathy, wind up shutting that down, and then like the whole society becomes like this complete, shut down sort of.
Well, you've been in the military. Empathy is not the most prized quality, because that doesn't get you people that you can control. And I was at a military school. All of the boys of my sort of caste in the UK went to schools that were effectively military schools. We were all trained by the regular army all through school, and that was because the type of school I went to was supposed to prepare and train, young British officers to go and run the empire, even though the empire hadn't existed for quite a while. By the time I went to school, it was still the same ethic, and first over the top into the machine gun fire type thing. Come on, lads, and rugby, fox hunting, being screamed at by sergeants in my face, from the age of 12 or whatever, regularly beaten. Why we do these things and not encourage empathy and encourage the boys to do that among themselves? Because then they become angry little monkeys, who are very, very depressed, and who will follow authority, and whose only outlet for passion will be violence or religious ecstasy. And the religious ecstasy doesn't have to be a religion. It could be the British Empire, or it could be a political party, or it could be, anything. And I think we've all observed in our lifetimes people being easily controlled through fear and anger. If you keep people angry and you keep people afraid, that's obviously why social media is so powerful, then they'll probably do what you tell them. And if you want to control people, that's a jolly good way to do it. If people are happy and empathizing with each other and, enjoying life, they're unlikely to go die on a foreign battlefield for you, because they'll say, sorry, no, we're good over here. Yeah, you chaps go knock yourself out with that war thing. We're all right. And of course, what's nice is that in the generations since World War II, at least in the West, we've seen a real move away from that militaristic way of thinking that's been going on for about 10,000 years in our culture, since the advent of agriculture, in fact. But in the 290,000 years of our species, sapiens, we actually didn't live like that before. Hunter-gatherers are highly empathetic, highly cooperative and strategic with each other. They have to be, or they die, because you're a mid-level predator out there. If you fragment as a group, the large predators will just get you. So your only superpower is communication. That empathy is the highest form of communication. So all of the hunter-gatherer cultures are conflict resolving. They're cultures of conflict resolution. Cultures that try to produce an agricultural surplus are by their very nature conflict creation, because it takes so many hands to get a crop into the ground and pull the crop out of the ground that in a bad year, in a not good harvest year, there'll be more mouths to feed than the grain can do, and that's going to lead to all the ills that we find. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse, back to a sort of more negative type of horse imagery, war, famine, pestilence, and death. Only death has been around forever. War, famine, and pestilence, in terms of epidemics, that's a post-agricultural thing. So our cultures have been for the last 10,000 years doing a very, very thorough job on using fear and control to further economic ends.
Yeah, that's such an interesting. I heard you mention that with the agriculture, and it makes a lot of sense to me. It just naturally resonates, and it's.
Oh, sorry, just press pause. There's so much. I should have switched off my phone. It's actually Rowan. This is my son, Rowan. All right. So listen, my friend. I am on a podcast right now, talking about Horseboy, because I thought you were calling a while ago. I don't know if they've paused recording now. I think it's a recording. So do you want to say anything to the people on this podcast, and then I'll call you back a bit later for a proper chat? I can hold you up towards the microphone. Can you guys hear him?
Yeah, we can. Hello, Rowan.
There he is.
Hi, guys.
That's Jason and Alyssa.
Hi, Rowan.
How are you? It's very great to meet you.
We've been talking about, among other things, horses and your and my experience with Betsy and other horses. While we're on this, before we adjourn for our own chat later, do you have anything that you want any insights to give on what horses have done for you?
Yes, I would just like you all to know that horses have made me feel a lot better since I was a kid, as they were my way of learning how to verbalize, learning new vocabulary, and just reconnecting out in nature particularly. In fact, I'm still in the house of where these healing events happened.
It's wonderful. It's amazing that you called in the middle of this, and thanks for sharing that insight.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
That was beautiful.
Just recently, are you familiar with a guy named Tu Lam? He's a military commando. He was a Green Beret and a Vietnam refugee in his childhood. And I was recently listening to him talk about his experiences coming from Vietnam as a child and nearly dying in many ways in refugee camps and all that kind of thing. And then ultimately his mom got connected with and married a Green Beret here in the U.S. And he started training at age 16 and was like very much in this like warrior ethos like his whole entire life and existence, and went through and served 23 years in the army and top level special ops. And so he's talking, I actually listened to him on the Next Level Soul podcast, and the reason I bring that up is because empathy for me has been this long-standing aspect of my life and my existence as a child and all through my adult life. But I can definitely point to areas where I either subconsciously or consciously shut it down. And then I just recently, because as we were getting ready for this podcast, I re-listened to your talk with Warwick and that idea of the agriculture and the war stemming from agricultural societies. And I'm thinking but then putting that into kind of comparison or contrasting it with Tu Lam's message, and he spent his entire military career going around the world literally searching for and killing people in a lot of ways, but having in his mind he's protecting the innocent, which that's what we are ultimately taught or perhaps indoctrinated into when we become military members at any level. And so I'm just wondering I don't know.
How do we deal with that paradox?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. How do we reconcile that?
Well, it's the word is paradox. So if we are caught in this 10,000 year cycle, and if we're on our way, hopefully, out of this 10,000 year cycle, which I think we are, because despite a lot of the things that are going on in the world now that, you know, we can look to and say, oh no, it's still terrible. Look at Gaza, look at Ukraine, look at South Sudan. The fact is, it's interesting, there's less war going on now than there was 50 years ago. Certainly less war now than there was 100 years ago. So it's good that we obviously are still very much concerned with the fact that the wars that do still go on are not good and need to stop. It is also true that we are moving further towards peace, I think, than as a species than we have done for a long time. When you are caught in that cycle, though, and there is a military conflict, then the fact is that that is a reality you're dealing with. And if you wish it to be otherwise, then your only hope is to remove yourself physically, if you possibly can, from the sector, the geographical sector where that conflict is happening. And that might or might not be possible. You might be stuck there for whatever reason, or it could happen very suddenly that an armed group, you know, appears or whatever. And so in that state, you cannot do without a military. However, if one's great desire is to be part of the military, and if one glorifies the military, then one does also feed the beast. And so I think a lot of soldiers go through this, where they start from a very good ethical place. They want to protect the people of their culture, and that is a good thing. And then they begin, despite themselves, to glorify. And then they become agents of death. And then they have to reconcile that with spirituality. And it's one thing to look at it from the outside and say, well, you know, they're agents of death, so therefore they can't. But the fact is, one also cannot, at this stage of our evolution, do without them. So to relegate them from the spiritual conversation is also not fair and not good. So the interesting thing about if you are a killer, I have quite a few friends who are in special forces, and quite a few of them are killers. And I don't want to speak for them because that would not be fair to them. And they all have slightly different takes on this. But all of them that I know are actually very, very kind people. And for them, living with the legacy of taking other people's lives is very, very difficult. And some of them feel that the conflicts they were in were to some degree justified, and some feel that they absolutely were not. And for those people, it's even harder. I'll tell you an interesting story about how this can relate, relating to horses. The first ever real healer I met, you know, a lot of people know that I've worked with shamans and healers a lot in different indigenous cultures, but the first one I really met was not indigenous. He was from the countryside just north of London, really where the suburbs met the countryside. And the reason I met him, okay, here's a convoluted story. I was riding semi-professionally for a lady outside of London who was it was eventing. And so this horse that she had was one of these meta horses, in that he would win kind of any competition he went into. He went international, but he was also just this very calm, sort of sagacious personality, and you could put anybody on him. You could put a child who could not ride at all, and he's extremely powerful and he would just take that person very, very quietly and kindly around the farm. He was an extraordinary horse in many ways, and he got a sudden sort of kidney failure, and he dropped from a horse with healthy weight to a virtual skeleton in a matter of a couple 2-3 months. And we went to vet after vet after vet. Eventually, the vet said, look, we can't figure out what's wrong here. I suggest you contact a faith healer. And at that stage of my life, in my early 20s, I knew nothing of this. A faith healer? I don't know. Where do we find a faith? Oh, well, what is that even? Now, that area of London, or on the outskirts of London, there's a lot of old traveller gypsy Romany encampments. And they are known for having some traditions with this. So we contacted a few of them, but we couldn't really make any headway. And the horse ended up being put down. And when the horse was put down, I was the one who had to take him to be shot. And frequently when a horse is really, really ill and really suffering, when it's their time to go, it's their time to go. They're like, dude, I'm out of here. It's no quality of life. Take me out. Because horses are not they're not sentimental about death. Like we are. Most animals are not. It's a sort of a bit of a human thing, this preoccupation with life for life's sake and so on, projections of the imagination, terror and that sort of thing. But this horse was not ready to go. And so when the knacker man approached him, he backed up and he didn't want it. But it happened anyway. And I felt terrible. But I also didn't know what else to do because the horse was basically at death's door. Anyway, about 2 weeks after that, I was in a cocktail party in London, and it was a sort of media type cocktail party, some TV type people. And I was chatting to this TV producer woman, and she said, I said, what have you been working on? She said, a TV documentary series about animal faith healers. I'm like, where were you 2 weeks ago? And I said, okay, did you meet anybody who you thought was good? And she said, actually, I thought most of them were charlatans, except for this one guy, this little old man who lives in a trailer, a caravan, we call them in England, just north of London, called Charles Siddle. And there's this veterinary practice in the area who refers people to him whenever it's like a bullet job, whenever it's just like something which the vets can't deal with. And we followed him, this is her talking, healing a racehorse broodmare belonging to the Queen, who was very, very valuable and so on, got a lymphoma. And he took this horse on, and a year later, she said, we followed the story. A year later, there was no trace of the cancer, and the horse was having another foal. So I said, please put me in touch with this man. So, because despite the fact that we'd lost this horse, I wanted to know more. Long story short, I followed him as a journalist, because remember, I'm a journalist as well, for about a year. And I followed him on the case of 3 horses, each of whom had something that they shouldn't really have recovered from. One had lost a big chunk of its scapula in a big accident. Another one had burned away most of its lungs in a barn fire. And I forget now, this is about 30 years ago, what the other one had. But I followed it up for a year, and each of these horses not only recovered, but returned to work. And I said to him, how do you do this? And he said, well, if I tell you, you're just going to think I'm nuts. And I said, okay, try me. So he said, all right. So he said, I used to be friends with a vet, a man in a wheelchair who was also a vet, and his name was Buster Lloyd Jones. And Buster Lloyd Jones, in the 60s and 70s, was a vet who wrote popular books about funny stories about being a vet. So he's quite well known. And he and Charles used to show dogs together, and also they would have the odd share in a racehorse syndicate where they sort of own a leg of a racehorse with 4 or 5 other people. They like to do this. And Buster, he said, Buster died almost 20 years before this thing happened, where I was stood in a stable with a horse that had this injury, and we were wondering what to do. And everyone else went out of the stable, and I was looking at this horse, and I look to my left, and there's Buster in his wheelchair, and he's been dead 18 years. So I said, yeah, you are nuts. He goes, I told you. He said, yeah. And then he said, you're going to be my hands. And then he disappeared. And he said, but I could still see the ruts of where the wheelchair had been in the straw. And he said, ever since then, Buster comes to me at night and tells me what to do. And sometimes my mother as well. And I said, well, what are these people doing hanging around after they die? You know, what's it? He said, well, actually, Rupert, you can hang around a bit for a while if you want to, if you feel there's sort of unfinished business or stuff you need to do or help or some mission you want to accomplish or whatever. You can actually hang around for a bit before you go back to wherever it is we came from before we were born. And you don't have to worry about heaven and hell and all that. That's all irrelevant. That's just in people's minds. That's in the human imagination. That the life and death has nothing to do with that stuff. But yeah, you can hang around a bit. And so I then found out he was also healing people. And he said, well, listen, Roo, I was a commando in the war, in World War II. And he's this tiny little guy. And like, I'm a short guy. And he was like way shorter than me. Tiny little guy. You would think harmless. He said, Rupert, I killed so many people in the war. And we were commandos, so we were special forces. So it was done with knives, and it was done by stealth, and it was done by strangling, and it was done with garrote, and this kind of thing. And he said, look, I feel I am just trying to give back for the lives I took. And he was the gentlest man, the sweetest man, the kindest man. But, he was caught up in that war. And if Hitler had won that war, well, things might not have gone quite so well as they have, in the Western world since. So, was he justified in doing what he did? In one way, you could say, well, he was definitely on the side of the good guys, trying to stop the Third Reich from doing all the horrible things that it did, and succeeding with that. But on a human level, yeah, he took all those lives. And so he became a healer.
That's interesting. This is one of the things that I've struggled with as a military veteran myself, is that I don't know, I haven't really dove into this with many people or anybody. It's just kind of like a thought process I have in my own mind of and I'm healing from it. It's like this idea of like not feeling good enough or worthy enough to even be called a military veteran, because there's so many of these like layers and like I surely wasn't at the tip of the spear, so to speak, in like a commando type setting or even close to that. But I did experience war or parts of war, and the experience that I had. And one thing that has like really been illuminated to me throughout the process of like unpacking that and I guess understanding trauma a bit more is that we are all like living this life experience, and we're all affected by it in different ways. And so like the two Lams of the world and the World War II veteran that you just mentioned, they have a way of like being in the thick of it. And then there's so many people on this earth that don't even get close to that, but they're experiencing really similar things within their mind and body because of their own experiences of trauma. And I guess what I'm getting at, like the healing path for us all, that spiritual journey, if you will, don't you think it's the same regardless of how we I guess articulate the levels of trauma in our own minds?
Well, put it this way, the original human cultures on the planet, like for example the Bushmen of the Kalahari, who I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with, hunting and gathering cultures, which are the original human cultures, is the blueprint, if you like, of human culture. They are all cultures of conflict resolution, as I said earlier. What does that mean? So it's not just waiting for a conflict to come up. It's about prevention is better than cure. So every hunting and gathering family, let's say in the Kalahari, where they use poison arrows, and the poison comes from a pupa, a larva of a type of beetle that lives on a wild coffee tree. And this larva, if you squeeze its juices onto an arrow, if you puncture your skin with the arrow, you'll die. If you put your hand in your eye, you'll go blind. And but what's interesting about this poison is that it cooks out. When you cook the meat, it neutralizes the poison. It's amazing technology. But given that every household has enough poison arrows in it to wipe out everybody in the clan if one person were to go nuts, this idea of dealing with imminent mass destruction and fear is quite real, and has been for a long time. So and they, despite the fact that they are very peaceful people, they know that we're also funky monkeys. We're sort of half bonobo, half peace love, just want to love each other, and etc., and half chimpanzee, I'm gonna rip your head off. And we're sort of completely schizophrenic, the human species, this way. So in order to make sure that the chimpanzee does not get the upper hand in our psyche, the healers will call ceremonies once every 10 days or so, just for the group, to kind of wash the psychic dirty laundry, if you like, of the group, to keep people cool. So this, you don't need necessarily to have undergone a particular type of trauma to need this, because whoever you are as a human being on planet Earth, this schizophrenic nature of our species, to some degree gives us all a certain degree of suffering. I'd rather use the word suffering than trauma, because I feel trauma is an overused word. Trauma is sort of, I think, blunt force trauma. Trauma is like if someone hits you and there's like a big old wound, that's trauma. Breaks your bone, or it, mangles you somehow, and needs a big sort of healing process and rehab process. But not all forms of suffering are trauma, but it doesn't necessarily mean that suffering is any less real. And sustained suffering over time is its own slow drip trauma. So this has been addressed really since we've been on the planet, and the oldest cultures on the planet are very good at making sure that this is addressed. That's empathy. That's compassion. That's walking a mile in someone else's shoes to a large degree. So my feeling is, you don't need to have been the tip of the spear to know that you are part of a machine that was delivering, this not great thing to other members of our species. And at the same time, we are not yet at a stage where we've evolved that we can do without it. So that just leaves you, Jason, with the knowledge that, okay, because was caught up in this paradox, it's simple. I just need to heal. And I just need to be an agent of healing and help other people find their agency for healing. Because the rights and wrongs of the situation were a little bit beyond you,
I love that. Thank you. And that's just very synchronistic, because it just brings me back to this idea that we're all doing what we can in our own ways of either getting to the light we have within or actually expressing it. And to me, that's what healing is all about, is actually just getting to the source of the divinity that we all have within us. And no matter what sort of suffering lies on the surface of that, whether it's like in your son's case, and early on in his life, the autism aspect, and whatever other diseases, like, I've experienced like leukemia in my adult life, or the commando experiencing the throes of death from a war machine. We're all essentially charged with either ignoring the divinity we have within us, or hopefully uncovering it on this planet. So
Right,
that
we do get chances. We do get chances to be part of the healing. So there's the healing that we do personally. But for example, my family in Africa, colonial family. So, what's a colonial family? We were pirates, man. Vikings. People glorify the Vikings. Really? I mean, they raped and pillaged and hurt people and harmed people and were absolute arseholes, to each other and to anyone else they encountered. And we've inherited that culture, and we glorify, I'm a Viking. Well, is that really such a great thing to be? Now, I do have a lot of Viking heritage, as probably do you, meaning that on my mother's side, they are Dutch and English and Scottish, Viking Celts who in the 18th century went out to Africa, as your forebears went out to America. And we all know what our forebears did. They didn't behave terribly well, Now, not every single one. Some of them behaved in a perfectly lovely way, but many did not. And certainly any of our forebears who went out definitely profited from the conquest, but it was conquest. So you are the product of conquistadors, and so am I. That is just a fact. What was interesting for me, though, is that on my other side of my family is Jewish, and they were escaping from pogroms, mass killings in Eastern Europe, and then trying to get out to those colonies where they could at least get away from what was happening in Eastern Europe. And then I've got other family, which is not white, in South Africa, because, my parents are African. And my non-white family are the ones who are related by marriage to the last group of San Bushman hunter-gatherers in South Africa. And that's how I got involved in the whole land rights thing. And I was fortunate enough to then be sort of recruited by that, if you like, side of my extended family to be a human rights advocate for that group of hunter-gatherers to get their legal title to their ancestral land. And so I was privileged to be part of a healing process that my own forebears had caused a need for. And let's say you're American, in America it's a little different because the volume of European settlement in the Americas was so vast, compared to Africa. Hundreds of millions of people coming over, that it's very difficult to necessarily say, oh, my great-grandfather did this, or my great-great-grandfather did that. But in Africa, there weren't that many whites going over. So you absolutely know what your grandfather and your great-grandfather did. You absolutely know. The records are all there. So it's hard to avoid. In America, it's easier to avoid. Or perhaps one's forebears came over after all that conquest, and just sort of settled in New York or something long after the Dutch had wiped everyone out there, or in the West long after, the last, genocides against the Native Americans out there. And so therefore don't feel a direct connection to those wars of conquest and genocides and so forth. But nonetheless, they happened. So the healing of the American mind and psyche and the rewilding of some parts of America and the rise of indigenous land rights in America is, it's something very much worth engaging with, because just perhaps karmically, it behoves us to do that, having benefited from the conquest. That doesn't necessarily mean people say, "Oh, are you saying I've got to feel guilty about?" No, I'm not. I'm not saying that at all, because you, Jason, or you, Alyssa, played no part in that. And by the way, you know, Native Americans also did plenty of awful things to each other, you know, without the interference of any white person, both before white people arrived and after. So because people are people. But yeah, we were the ones who came in with all the technology. So therefore, you know, we nicked the land. But I think what I'm driving at here is that we all can just choose to be part of the healing, rather than having a sort of defensive attitude to, well, it's not my fault. Because I think it's a given that it's nobody's fault. It's nobody's fault at all. It's just part of the human story. So we just want to be part of the healing rather than the not healing, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I love for me, I look at fault and responsibility as two different things. So I think collectively as humanity, we're all individually responsible just by virtue of being on this planet, but we're not all directly at fault. Like we need to be like judged and locked up behind bars, but we all have the responsibility to recognize where we've come from and where we are now and where we're ultimately going to go. And it sounds like, you know, from your perspective in your life, and of course working with the horses and your son and everything that you've went through and all the suffering, I mean, that was apparent in your documentary, Horse Boy. And I mean, you guys didn't cut that out. There was a great deal of suffering going on within that documentary that I felt. I mean, it moved me emotionally in a number of ways. Both having the military background, the ability to kind of know and be in austere environments, and you guys brought that to life very, very well and strongly. But also recognizing it's like where you were, and like you didn't ask for a son necessarily that had these disabilities, quote unquote, but yet you were taking the responsibility to move through it and heal. And
well, you know, you just met him obviously because he just, you know, appeared on this podcast rather miraculously, you know, and it's hard to imagine that was the non-verbal tantruming incontinent person who the movie showcased, because look at him, he's independent and he's doing amazing. The difficulty and the suffering, of course, therefore, was not the autism. Autism is not the problem at all. You know, when I first met Temple Grandin, you know, and I walked into her office, she was flapping and stimming and squinting, and I was like, oh, that's cool. You can be like that and have like 2 PhDs and be a tenured professor and write all these bestsellers and be just fine. So clearly the problem is not the autism. The problem is perhaps sensory overload and an overactive amygdala in your brain producing too much cortisol, stress hormone. This is often the case. And disorientation, feeling that you're lost in this shark-infested world of, you know, crazy monkeys. You know, an awful lot of people with autism, you know, report this feeling of, you know, just utter bewilderment of finding themselves sort of on the wrong planet, and surrounded by threats, you know, perceived or otherwise. And it's that suffering that's the problem. And that, of course, one can address. And of course, so many of us suffer from something similar. It's just in the case of my son, it was particularly acute. And so it came home to me very, very, very clearly, very early, that the autism itself not only was not a problem, but there were actually many gifts associated with it. So, for example, this ability to really focus on things and this very quiet ego. So my son doesn't really compare himself to other people. He doesn't have this little voice in his head all the time saying he's shit, you know, like you or I do, where we're always comparing ourselves to somebody else and usually thinking that we come up short. And then that can make us behave badly, you know. So that feeling of unworthiness often moves us to do not great things and think not great thoughts and so on. So people with that type of autism I often find are very healing to be around, because they don't press what neuroscientists would call your mirror neurons. They don't make you feel that you have to compare yourself with them. So you yourself get a break from the little voice in your head telling you you're shit all the time. And that is incredibly healing. So when you go into places like the Kalahari and you meet healers there, you often notice that they exhibit neuropsychiatric symptoms. And these neuropsychiatric symptoms, it could be autism, it could be epilepsy, it could be schizophrenia, it could be bipolar, it could be all sorts of things, are not regarded in their culture as things that relegate you from participation in society. Quite the opposite. They are regarded as job qualifications, because you already have one foot in the spirit world, and therefore you are targeted for training as a healer. Now, the whole shamanism thing is very interesting. And a podcast like this, I should imagine that the vast majority of listeners probably have no problem with the use of a term like spirit world. But we know that, out there in mainstream society, a lot of people might. So here's a really interesting scientific fact. This study is really quite recent. I think it's in the last year. A study has been done on autistic brains, particularly the pineal gland. And it seems that the pineal gland of autistic people was found to produce on average more dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the strongest hallucinogen known to man. It's what you get in ayahuasca. It's what you get in datura. It's what you get in a lot of those medicinal plants. But we produce it as well. We produce it ourselves naturally in our pineal gland. And if we produce it enough, it becomes a transducer, means it changes energy from one type of energy to another, like light to heat, for example, within our brain's perception. So it changes electrical energy into the perception of light and sound. So you see things and you hear things. So, and then of course, a skeptic would say, well, that's just a hallucination, caused by a chemical in the brain. And someone else would say, no, well, that's just allows you to see what normally is beyond our perception. Who's right? Well, it doesn't much matter because we know it happens. And what seems to be the case is that people with autism produce more of this DMT, dimethyltryptamine, naturally than neurotypical people. So do they indeed have a foot in the spirit world? Well, it would appear so. And the science would seem to support it. So all of these things become very interesting, and what is often a surprise to me is when one finds that there can be a desire to prove this position or that position, or be right or be wrong about these things, as if it was in any way relevant, or if it mattered, because we'll all be dead someday and it will be completely irrelevant. But what it can do is make our time on this planet richer and more interesting. And we started this conversation talking about curiosity and playfulness. Being right often isn't much fun. And, being curious and not quite knowing if you're right or not, but certainly being interested is more fun. So why not that?
So true. And that brings to mind, I had a very strong Christian upbringing, and the idea of having faith like a child, and that has come up in different teachings that I've learned about, of just, this childlike attitude and playfulness and about our existence. And it's interesting that you bring up DMT, and it was last year, I think I read Rick Strassman's book on the DMT, the spirit molecule, and I think he was one of the first, if not the only, psychiatrist who did direct studies of, I think he was doing intravenous injections of DMT to study the effects, and every single one of them brought the subject or the patient into not only a state of altered consciousness, but they were reporting seeing like similar beings and like being transported into essentially like ER triage rooms and like different dimensions and stuff. Is wild.
And then, people will have a great desire to rationalize that and say, oh, well, that's just this or that's just that. Who cares?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, right. And as you're well aware, I'm sure, like with your work in India and whatnot, I mean, Vedic texts from thousands of years ago go into this, like the so-called the third eye is the physiological feeling that we're having on the front of our forehead in the middle of our two eyes that is essentially the pineal gland activating.
Well, the third eye is it's actually coherence with the pineal gland and the pituitary gland together. And the pituitary gland sits right behind your forehead, and then if you go in a straight line back from there to the middle ventricle of the brain, that's your pineal gland, called pineal because it resembles a pine cone. And when those two come into resonance and coherence, that seems to be when what this sort of third eye opening thing can happen. Because pineal gland, pituitary gland is very interesting too. Serotonin, oxytocin, and so forth, and lots of other cool things. So then that becomes a euphoric bliss awareness state of these other ways of perceiving consciousness.
And isn't it such that your work all over the world, and I'd like to, like I said before we started recording, like in my life where I'm at now and coming through cancer, which is like the big word in our society, like you're diagnosed with cancer and you're ultimately just going to die. And I'm definitely moving and coming through that and just feeling like just exploring the world and all that it has to offer. How did you get into, and you touched on it a little bit, like having familial ties and whatnot, ancestry ties, but I've been to a few different places, and of course with the military had traveled around, but I'm always curious as to how people actually, like, number one, don't die by traveling around the world, and how do you connect in with the right people? Are you just kind of doing it arbitrarily and letting your spirit guide you, so to speak?
Ask questions and follow your intuition, but ask people. Remember, I'm a journalist. So I'm curious. So, but in terms of of sort of shamanic healing and that sort of thing, I probably saw my first example of that when I was about 7. On my grandfather's farm in Zimbabwe, in southern Africa. Witch doctors, what would be then called Ngangas, working on healing the farm workers there. And, my family being quite racist, saying, well, that's just what the black people do. And then as a kid, you couldn't help but notice, well, okay, but they seem to get sick and get better. And they don't have much access to Western medicine. And look, they seem to be doing all right on this. And then you can't be around indigenous cultures without that conversation of healing constantly coming up. I mean, it's not like it's some hidden thing that people talk, it's right out there in the open. The ceremonies going on all the time, and people are quite happy to talk about it. So one of the nice things about it too is you don't have to approach it with reverence. It's not like, oh, it's this holy thing and you've got to kind of eat shit in some way to demonstrate that your reverence and your respect. It's not like going to church. And I mean, there are cultures like that, of course, outside of Christianity, and there, but they're all as bullshit as each other, because those are just people wanting to control other people using the language of spirituality. But any of the traditions where it's actually, truly used on a kind of daily basis for healing, it's much more casual. It's much more friendly. It's much more normal. that people say, well, look, this is what we do. This is our reality. It's, you know, it's, yeah. And if you, yeah, we'll show you how we do it. And then there might be some certain mysteries that you might have to be around longer in order to be exposed to, like shape shifting, for example. It's a very interesting one. I've seen that happen. And the way it happens is not how you'd expect it would happen. It's not sort of American Werewolf in London, you know, someone growing fangs and, you know, hair appearing on their bodies, but it's definitely happens. Something like that, you'd have to kind of be around a bit, you know, to see it. You'd have to, you know, live there and spend time there and be part of the life. But when you ask that question, how do you find out? You know, if I go to a part of the world where I don't know a healer or a shaman, and I would like to find one. So, for example, when I took my son to Australia to be healed by the Kuku Yulanji, who are an Aboriginal tribe up in Queensland in the Daintree Rainforest. And the reason we were there was because I had to go there on book tour, and my son was with me. So I thought, well, let's look for a healing. I had no contacts among the Aboriginals at all. So what I tend to do if I'm in that position is I'll actually contact a Western clinic or hospital in a tribal area. And I'll say, is there a funny old man or a funny old woman who comes on the wards and sort of does stuff and, you know, ceremony type stuff? And they'll often say, yeah, there's this old woman. She comes around and she does this thing with feathers and, you know, she sings to them and they seem to get up and get better. So, hey, we're all about it. You know, the doctors are often very practical that way. Like, we don't know what she does, but hey, you know, it's good. And then I'll say, oh, who is that person? Can you put me in touch with that person? Or can you put me in touch with someone who can put me in touch with that person? And then you just begin to sort of peel back the onion layers. But at a certain point, you have to just take the plunge and just go and hope that you'll meet them. And you might not, but then you might meet somebody else, you know, and you take it from there. And you mustn't be attached to outcome. You just sort of take it as an adventure.
I think that taking it from an adventurous perspective is such a freeing, beautiful experience. And I've not done a crazy amount of traveling, but I've definitely heard Dad talk about it. I've heard others like you talk about, you know, the adventure that comes with traveling and seeking healing. It's such a beautiful thing to just go about, like, asking people. And you come from a journalist's perspective, and so listening to how you're able to use that in experiencing in finding these people that you're wanting to connect with, it's such a beautiful thing. So as we close up, I want to ask you, what's your favorite way to reinforce your horses?
Before that, we started this conversation with playfulness and curiosity, right? That's really what we're talking about here, the whole thing. Being lighthearted about life, really, rather than heavy-hearted about life. Because we might think maybe we do have many lives, but the one that we're having right now is the one we're experiencing. And it's nicer to be able to have a lighter heart. Horses can definitely help us with that, and ourselves. But you were asking how I find healing. You guys are probably sitting not 20 miles from a really good shaman. I mean, you're in southern Arizona, my friends. They're at the Yaqui are right there. The Navajo are not that far away from you. The Huichol are just over the border. These guys have incredible healing traditions. Go check it out. Show up, you know, and ask and see what happens, you know. Particularly, and the best way to do that is to go as a patient, because these people are professionals. So Jason, you know, if you're in recovery, perfect reason to go and say, hey guys, can you help me out? You know, I'm you know, genuinely, I'm here, you know, please have at me with your professional skills. Okay, how do I reinforce the horse? Was that the question? By having fun with them. So interestingly, I'm known as a dressage trainer. And I could bang on about what the training of classical dressage horses and all of that, and probably bore you half to death with it. Although it's a beautiful thing if it's done again with a bit of a light heart, because it's showing horses how to do stuff that actually they already know how to do, but just when a monkey would like them to do it. But the mental and physical buy-in that you need from a horse, if the horse is going to be your colleague, for example, when I'm doing therapy work and that sort of thing, is enormous. So you have to then say, is this horse ready to receive information in this way or not? And it's very like a child or me. I'm not usually ready to learn until I've played. So, and I'm certainly not usually ready to work until I've played. So when I'm giving dressage clinics, often what can be surprising to people is I tell them, the first thing I teach them is the necessity for what we call crazy time. Let horses play in groups and encourage them and interact with them and set up playgrounds of poles on the ground in all sorts of different angles and perhaps jumps if that's what the horses seem to like to do. And you're not trying to train them to jump or really mind if they jump or don't jump. What you're doing is you're creating a playground and let them do it together, socially in a group, because that's what horses like to do, and interact with them. They like to play with you because they're selectively bred to seek out relationships with humans, and enjoy that with them and let them go bit bananas, and just like you play with your kids in the playground. And then after that, and all the endorphins have kicked in and all the BDNF, the brain derived neurotrophic factor, then have a conversation about, would you like to learn this thing or do this thing? And then what happens is the horse has agency. And if the horse isn't ready, well, they're not ready, and then you don't force them. You go play again. And sooner or later, the horse will just sort of show up and say, well, I'm curious. Okay, show me this thing that you kind of like to show me, Mr. Monkey. And then you're like, all right, well, here it is. And then so the reinforcement is simply the encouragement to play, really, I feel, honestly.
Oh, I love that. And it brings me to my final question. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the topic of toilet humor.
My favorite. Yes, that brings us close.
So there's a bit of a story on that. So Alyssa, when she was younger, used to have a dollhouse. It was just like one of these Fisher Price plastic dollhouses, and
my mind is already going to 25 different jokes.
Her brother, her and I used to sit and play it, and so there was a toilet in the bathroom, and it would open up, and the refrigerator had a pizza, and so I would often put the pizza in the toilet. And then I would open the toilet and I would say, pizza poop, and we would all just bust up laughing. Well, Alyssa's mom would get really, really, really upset about that. I mean, we were just talking about that as we heard you mentioning the toilet humor aspects.
Well, toilet humor is only really funny if there's somebody in the room who refuses to find it funny. And then, of course, it becomes exponentially funnier, right? Without that, it sort of loses its amplification. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us just a bit more on that about why. And to me, this kind of draws it all to a close. And even in the book that Alyssa and I are bringing forward, called Hasta La Vista Leukemia, in it, Faith and her horse Kriya, they go into a meditation and blast off in a sombrero spaceship to outer space, and Faith has leukemia, and she is visualizing in the spaceship to ultimately the dirty or the gross or the unhealthy blood cells exit her body and go into this space lock portal that she flushes out into space. So there was some toilet humor in that as well.
Well, toilet humor is important. Why is it so important? Because in a straight-laced, controlling, conservative, hierarchical society such as ours, to say the word poo, or even better, shit, is automatically an act of rebellion. And if you are somebody who's been overly therapized and told since you were very young that there's something wrong with you, to some degree your spirit is broken. And the only way you're going to regain your self-respect is through rebellion. So toilet humor for children that are undergoing that kind of, you're not right, there's something wrong with you. Toilet humor can be a really, really good portal back to, there we go, back to self-respect. And you can, of course, teach all of science through poo, because something goes in and goes down into your gut, and then it has to go up and round, and well, that's physics, that's hydraulics, and also forth. Then you have the squirgler wurglers that happen when something's in there, that's chemistry. And then there's what you poop out, and there's what you retain, that's biology. And one of my fondest memories is giving a horseboy method training at a very, very Christian conservative therapeutic barn in Alabama. And the staff there were not really on board with my toilet humor, which of course just made me do it even more, because of course, trying to self-sabotage, and but I eventually explained basically what I explained to you. And I said, look, there really is a value in it. And come on, you cannot tell me that it's not funny when someone makes a noise from their bottom. It is God's free joke. It is funny. You cannot stand there in front of me and tell me it's not funny. And if you stand in front of a kid and tell them it's not funny, then the kid knows that you're just full of that thing that you're pretending is not funny, and they will not trust your judgment because you're saying the sky is red when it's blue, And so let's just agree that it's funny. And I gave them a challenge. I said, okay, just humor me here. Come back tomorrow and show me a way show me that you've taken in what I've said about how to teach science, at the very least, through poo. They showed up the next day and they had this long stocking with a tennis ball, and they were squeezing the tennis ball down inside the stocking as a piece of poo. And each one was supposed to take a station, and it was the gut, right? Who was going to be this part of the gut, who's going to be that part of the gut. And this cry went up from the very, very nice lady, who's actually a very good friend of mine now, who was running the thing, saying, who wants to be the rectum? And about a dozen hands went up. I'm like, there is a God.
That's so great.
Took me about half an hour to get back off the floor. Yeah, brilliant.
And let's just be real. I mean, horses have the best toilet humor ever. I mean, like, you could be so serious, like hanging out with a horse, and they just like let it rip. So it's
they certainly do. They certainly do. They certainly do. And if you're a competitive farter like me, and you sort of consider yourself, to be sort of Olympic contending sort of thing, a horse will put you in your place immediately. It's like, sorry, I'm not worthy. Yeah. I had this horse called Neron. He could fart for about close on 30 seconds. They like bring the entire arena to a halt. Everyone just like staring open mouths, like, is it possible? Like, where's it even coming from? It's crazy, but sustained, and a sort of international panel of judges all holding up 9s and 10s, it's for volume, timbre, resonance, smell,
so
yeah, top marks.
Well, thank you so much, Rupert. I feel like I could talk to you for hours upon hours on end, and your level of like knowledge and just wisdom just really is inspiring to me, and it gosh, I just really appreciate all that you've been able to share with us today.
Very kind, thank you. Wisdom is in the eye of the beholder. If you're inside my nervous system, it doesn't feel terribly wise. But you obviously, with what you've been living through, have great wisdom to impart. And I'm very glad you're doing this podcast and helping to make the world a bit of a better place through it. So thank you for having me. And you, Alyssa, too.
Thank you so much for all of this, for joining us. It's such an honor to have you here on the show, and hear a bit more about your story, and such a pleasure being able to talk a second
Yeah,
with
it's brilliant,
Rowan
wasn't it?
too. So thank you
such
for
a gift
that.
that he called. All right, my friends. Who wants to hit that red? Oh, shall I tell people? God, I'm so bad at. We're supposed to self-promote. Yes, websites, that sort of thing. If they want to. Okay, if people want to know the work, how to get involved in the work we do with autism and horses, go to horseboymethod.com. It'll tell you how you can get trained. You can get trained online, or you can do a live course. We have something called Movement Method, which is how you do the same thing without horses. And that's very, very useful in the home, in schools, etc. Go to kidsmustmove.com. And that's sort of basically applied neuroscience. And then we have something called Athena Equine. Athena, Athena, -equine.com. And that's how we use the classical horse training as its own therapy, often for people with trauma, young adults with autism, etc., and also to rehab injured or horses that had a tough time, which of course are a lot of the horses that get donated to therapeutic riding programs. And then finally, if people want to know more about the classical training methods and how to do that, if you go to a website called longridehome.com, we show you how to take your horse from zero to the piaffe, dancing in place, through a series of videos in hand, not riding, walking next to the horse. And there's also a shamanic program on there called Little Besa. Little Besa was the name that the Bushman gave me. And something called Face Your Bull, which is day-to-day neuroscience to dealing with the challenges that come up. So horseboymethod.com if you would like to know how to work with horses and autism. Movement Method if you'd like to work with the brain in whatever way, but without horses. Athena-equine.com, how to train horses kind of as its own therapy. Longridehome.com for classical training, bit of shamanism, bit of neuroscience. Hopefully somewhere in that menu of the restaurant you'll find something helpful.
Yeah, perfect. And for those of you listening on the podcast platforms, we will definitely have all those links in the show notes page on reinforcethehorse.com, and links to your books and all that kind of stuff. We'll curate it all there. And again, Rupert, it's been fantastic talking to you, and give our love to Rowan, and we appreciate it. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.